Was nice and refreshing. I'm really honored to be able to be up here introducing these wonderful ladies to you guys today. I'm especially honored to have the opportunity to actually be in the audience and listen to so many wonderful and empowered women speak today. As a person who didn't really have much direction in terms of what I wanted to do before I turned up at this weird little law school nestled in the mountains in Vermont, I always gravitated towards very strong and powerful people who exude some sort of characteristic that just attracted me and made me feel safe and made me feel like being like those people could help me find my way in life. And when I started hearing about the panels and their composition, and when over the last couple of months while Ray and Terry Ann were putting this together, I just started getting so excited about all the names and all of the biographies that I was reading. And I'm really excited still. So without further ado, I'm going to start talking about these wonderful guests that we have here today. So, starting on the far right, we have Tabitha Poll-Moore. Tabitha earned her bachelor's degree from Wells College in Aurora, New York, where she focused on Latin American studies, Spanish, physiology, and sociology. She also completed her master's degree in marriage and family counseling from Syracuse University. Her desire to help vulnerable communities motivated her to complete a certificate in social justice, diversity, and inclusion from the University of Colorado. From supervising mental health clinicians to working as a probation officer, she's used her language skills to impact juveniles and families in need. Currently, she acts as a school counselor in North Clarendon, New Hampshire, where she developed the Life After High School series to help young students plan for the next steps in their professional lives. And she also founded the Rutland Area NAACP and currently serves as the president of that branch. Next up, we have Sarah George. Sarah George is the Chittenden County State's Attorney in Burlington, Vermont. She is a generational Vermonter with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and psychology from the University of Connecticut and a master's degree in forensic psychology from Castleton State University, and also a Vermont Law School alumni. So welcome back. I hope you're not too scarred by the cold. For 6 years, she acted as the Deputy State's Attorney in Chittenden County State's Attorney Office, and in 2017 was appointed by Governor Phil Scott to be Chittenden County State's Attorney, and on November 6, 2018, was elected to serve her first full term, so congratulations on that as well. Since being in the position, she has focused on ways to combat the opioid crisis, reform the criminal justice system, and strengthen public safety. So thank you very much for all of that. Up next, we have Kaya Morris. Originally from Chicago, Kaya lives in Bennington, Vermont, where she served in the General Assembly as a state representative from 2014 to 2016 and 2016 to 2018. She's the first African-American and person of color elected to the Bennington County and the second African-American woman to be elected to the legislature in Vermont history. She provides consultative services, workshops, and presentations on issues of diversity, equity, and leadership for organizations across the globe. She serves on the board of United Children's Services, is a Sisters of the Planet ambassador for Oxfam America, leader with Rights and Democracy Vermont, and is on the advisory council for Emerge Vermont and Black Lives Matter Vermont. Morris also holds an accomplished artistic career as an actress of stage, film, and television, spoken word performance, as a singer, dancer, and arts manager. And her work focuses on amplification of the voice of the oppressed, issues of human rights, and social justice. So thank you. Then up next, we have Charisse M. Perry. Charisse is a graduate of George Washington University and Suffolk University Law School. She is the Senior Manager of the Department of Support Services for the Massachusetts Trial Court Office of Court Management and the President of the Massachusetts Black Lawyers Association. Perry works primarily with disenfranchised populations and assists pro se litigants throughout the state of Massachusetts, and works on a variety of access to justice projects and serves on a variety of committees to assist people in obtaining equal access to the legal system. So thank you. And then finally, right here next to me, we've got Ebony Freedom. Ebony is the founder of Black Lives Matter Vermont. She grew up in the Bronx, New York before attending school at the University of Vermont. Her activism began in 2013 when she organized a 500-person march in protest of George Zimmerman's acquittal in his trial for killing Trayvon Martin. This movement eventually grew into the Black Lives Matter Vermont chapter. Alongside running Black Lives Matter Vermont, Freedom also runs a community center in Winooski, which also serves as a meeting place for Black Lives Matter Vermont. And before we go any further, I'm just also going to mention that Ebony Freedom is also showcasing a series of lovely Kenyan-made bags, proceeds of which go to their are going towards a new loom. So donations begin at $40 per bag, and they're all showcased over here on the table. So if you guys have a chance to go have a look, you're invited to do so. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to you guys. Yes.
Also, my activism started in '95.
Oh, I'm sorry. 1995. All right, so there you go. What? Oh, on the, you said from the right? So we'll start over there. Sorry about that, guys. A little bit of confusion. So if Tabitha wants to begin.
Hi. Hi. I'm not really sure what you want me to say, but give me a topic and I'll talk on it.
Race and the law.
Race and the law. Ooh, girl, don't even get me started.
That's why we're here.
Race and the law. And I also saw, women in professions and that sort of thing. I was a probation officer. For me, this work has always been intersectional. There's a couple of details that weren't quite right. I went to Wells College. My degree was psychology of Latin America in the context of its culture and language. And I did research in the Dominican Republic, where I learned quite a bit about how the government regime influenced women's ability to work in women's identity development, which is really kind of where a lot of my love came from. And in grad school, I wanted to be the next Dr. Ruth. That was my goal. But my internship didn't quite work out that way. I ended up, it's true, I was teaching human sexuality. I was like, yeah, this is it. But then my internship, as one of the only Spanish-speaking therapists in all of Onondaga County in New York, the population that I was dealing with was poor. It was people that looked like me, people that oftentimes didn't have access to resources. Really, even filling out forms was difficult. And through that process, I really got to see a lot of how folks are disenfranchised by the system. And then I started working with young people with they were gang affiliated, violent behaviors, murder, that sort of thing, far cry from my Dr. Ruth days. And through that, I really looked at how our government systems, and particularly our legal system, is a system of white supremacy. Hands down, it's probably the most functional system of white supremacy. And so through my curiosity and seeing kid after kid after kid get swept up by RICO laws, are y'all familiar with RICO? Yeah, that started right about the time in New York when I started doing gang work. And the program that I ran, the mental health component of, was started because RICO was all of a sudden coming through, and all these kids had already been had done their time, were getting re-swept up, and the concern about double jeopardy was a really big thing. And I got to wondering, what could I do? What is going on with their legal system? And as close as I wanted to get was probation. So I became a probation officer. In New York, you are a peace officer, which is very different than probation is here. Here, it's like actual social work. In New York, it's very law-based. You go to Albany for 3 weeks, you have your training, you get your legal training, you got to go to the range for a week, and I really got to understand the militant nature of our justice system, and that it really wasn't about justice. It was very much about control, and that was concerning to me. And I was recently just remembering this one case that I had where I really realized how our system fails. And I was on intake one day, and this gentleman came in with his DCF worker, CPS. How many of you are from New York? Anybody in New York? Woo! All right, he came in with his CPS worker, and he said to me, my son is missing. And I said, okay, well, if you're on intake, you either grant people access to court or you don't. And the guy on the bench was kind of known for being a holy terror, and you don't put anybody in front of, so she back there like that. All right, he was not a good holy terror. He ended up getting fired 10 years later for horrible practices. But so I was asking the dad more questions like we're supposed to do, and he's like, well, he's 15 years old in New York, 16, you're an adult, right? So nobody is, at this time, at 16, you're an adult, and you go into the adult system. So nobody really cares about a runaway who's 15 years old in New York. That was thing number one. It was pretty much a thing that if a kid was 15, 16, you You don't grant them access to court, parent access to court. Get out of here. You know, police aren't going to go looking for you. They got too many other things to do. But something about this dad, you know, he's like, you know, my son's been missing. He just came back to live with me a couple years ago. He was living with his grandmother. Grandmother died of cancer. Grandma raised him since he was 2 when his mother died of cancer. So it's a really estranged family. So I started, you know, getting in my feelings about it. And I'm like, look, you know, is your kid going to school? Yes, kid's going to school. Is your kid, out there doing drugs or selling? Nope. He's a straight A student, goes to school, but he's staying with his girlfriend. So I knew where he was. I knew he was going to school, wasn't in any danger, but the guy still asked me for permission to go to court to get a warrant. And so I'm like, look, Hedges is on the bench. Google Brian Hedges someday. Hedges is on the bench. The chance that he's going to grant this is slim to none for all these reasons, but, you know, you're trying to do right by your son, so, you know, let me know when you catch him. Yeah. 6 months down the road, I'd been promoted to the assistant director of juvenile detention. I was the first woman of color ever in the probation department's then 90-year history, first woman of color to reach the level of administration, which is unfortunately not unusual. And I get a call in the middle of the night, and hey, we have a kid coming in on a murder charge. Well, tell me about it. Young man, Anthony Weekfall was his name, murdered his girlfriend's 2-year-old. It was that kid. The details were horrifying. It's some of the most horrifying stuff I've ever read. My son was the same age as the little girl. Broke me completely. But through that experience, I really learned that we have some massive, massive gaps, even in systems that are trying to work together. And so now I'm back here in Vermont, and I am doing juvenile justice work, but as it's totally different here in Vermont, which you may have noticed, through DCF and training them. But that's kind of why am I here and talking about the law? Because I know that those of you who are doing this work are going to see these gaps, and we have to call them out. We have got to do something about them. Otherwise, we're going to have more. Ebony Jennings was the 2-year-old girl that was murdered. And it was our system. We failed. Here's the ironic part. Not ironic. So the dad didn't have custody of his son because he was physically abusive to the young boy when he was potty training. Beat him almost to the point where he was dead. So grandma gets custody. Grandma raises him. Kid's 13 years old, goes to live with his dad. Horrible relationship, understandably. Kid's 15 years old, goes to live with his girlfriend. Girlfriend's 18, he's 15, both go to school. He killed her, potty training her. So every bit of the system just completely failed these kids. So that's why I'm here. Is that good? Is that what I'm supposed to say? All right, that's my story.
Well, good luck. Follow that. Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah George. I am the Chittenden County State's Attorney. Vermont Law School alum, 2010. I have very mixed feelings being back here. My job now is incredibly stressful, and yet I still think that, like, Professor Teachout's con law was worse. Still here? Is he still here? Don't tell him I said that. So my kind of quick story, why I'm here, why I'm doing what I'm doing. I was getting my master's degree at Castleton. I wanted to be a behavioral analyst for the FBI. That was my kind of dream goal. And then I decided I didn't want to move to DC, and my partner got a job for Burton up in Burlington, so we moved up there instead, and I came to Vermont Law School. Once I started law school, I started seeing it a little bit in my master's degree as well, of like the injustices in our justice system that everybody talks about all the time, but was doing a lot of actual case studies and really seeing some of those examples like Tabitha was talking about, and felt like the only way you could really make a difference in the system is if you're part of it. So I was convinced I wanted to be a defense attorney. I went to law school with the goal in mind of becoming a public defender or eventually a private firm, making all kinds of money. And while I was in law school, I did clerkships at the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office under TJ my first year. And then my second year, I went to the public defender's office and did my internship there. And when I was doing my internship at the public defender's office, since I had taken evidence, I was allowed to have actual clients and appear in court. So I had a caseload. I had clients. And I had these two particular clients that were in really the same situation. They were both intermittently transient, had substance use issues, had mental health issues, and had committed these two kind of minimal misdemeanors. And they had absolutely committed the crime. There was really no defense to it at all. They had committed it. They both admitted they had committed it. But they really just needed services, connected to services. There was nothing the system could actually do to help them. So I went to the two different prosecutors that were assigned to each case, and I gave them both my spiel about a conviction won't do you any good on this guy. Let's just get him into Howard Center. We'll get him some services. Maybe he can do some community service or some other thing. And then if he completes all of that and follows through with it, will you dismiss the charge? One of them said, absolutely not. You just said that he committed it. You just said he was guilty of it, so he should plead guilty. He can do all that stuff on probation. And the other one said, yes, that makes sense. Let's do it. That was the moment that I realized that I needed to become a prosecutor. Because as much as I respect defense attorneys in our system, by the time it gets to them, a lot of the decisions that have harmed the individual have already been made. And again, great for them for doing what they do. They work really hard and they do not get paid enough money. But if you really want to make a difference in the system, I suggest any of you become prosecutors. And so that's what I did. I became a prosecutor and had this caseload for 6 years working under TJ, which I was lucky to work under a state's attorney who had a lot of those same kind of reform-minded policies in mind, but I know not every county in Vermont follows that. But I still recognized I had, all of us at any given time have about 200 to 250 cases each at a time. And although that is a ton of cases for, $35,000 a year and $200,000 in student loan debt from this lovely place, I still only had control of those 200 cases. And so there was still other people in my office that maybe were making decisions that I knew were harming people, either people of color or people in poverty, whatever the situation might have been. So when TJ was running for Attorney General, much like Ms. Fleming was saying, all of the people that were seeking the position, I wasn't thrilled with those options, and I didn't really want to work for them. And I was getting a lot of kind of question and pressure from other people to seek it myself, and I was like, I am not political. I have no interest in being a politician. But the more I started to realize that that was even more of a position of power, that you really can affect some serious change in the system, I decided to go for it. And so here I am, and now I am just doing what I can to recognize all of the injustices in our system and break them down, either by one large policy that I think can work or individually on a case-by-case basis, and figuring out how Chittenden County, which is, we have a third of Vermont's population in our county, even though I technically only have jurisdiction there, it gets enough attention statewide that if we start to do some things in Chittenden County, it really can put some pressure on the rest of the state, and that's what I'm trying to do. So that's my quick reason. Kaya.
She's like, and pass the mic.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, everyone. So I have a really complex story that some of you know bits and pieces of in multiple iterations, but I think what I'd like to share with you a little bit about my journey to becoming a legislator, what happened when I arrived, how my views on our legal system, and as well as how it impacts people of color in the state, how that kind of evolved. So I had no interest when I first moved here from Vermont. Moved here from Chicago. I came from a job in corporate America where I had a really fancy title because I was working for Orbitz.com, the travel website, so they had to give you like really special names. So I think I was an account management engineer, even though I did no engineering. I did a lot of back end, sort of analytic kind of work, but yeah, I wasn't engineering anything. So all the same, I went from having that sort of a job to moving here to Vermont and looking for a change of pace, a change of environment, an opportunity to do something different than what I had done before. I've always been moved by activism. My family has a long lineage of people who have stepped up in the different annals of history. For example, my great-grandparents were key individuals in the bombings down in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where our 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were murdered. So the church that was blown up, that was the place where my great-grandfather was the deacon, and he was beaten within an inch of his life and spent the rest of his life disabled because of that. But they were trying to establish a freedom school at their church, and this mob just didn't care who they tried to kill. They burned down the church, and then those 3 civil rights workers came to investigate that church bombing and then were murdered themselves. And we kind of kept having these little moments like that throughout history, but I didn't know what that would mean for me, right? Early in my life, before I even knew it was important, my family was impacted by a major legal precedent, which has just been settled 50 years after this case. I'm not telling you my age, I'm not quite 50, but so it started before I was a thought in my mother's life, right? But so coming from Chicago, my family was one of the first families to actually get to participate in the new Chicago housing project through the Gautreaux program. And this was a lawsuit, it was a landmark lawsuit that looked at discriminatory housing based on race and the fact that folks were being placed into like the most horrendous of conditions. Just so that you know about the longevity of your work, Alexander Polikoff, who's still kicking, great guy, really great. You should bring him in, have him talk before he's gone from our planet. He just settled that case last month. 50 years, just settled that case. But he stuck in for that fight because it made a huge difference for my family. My family was able to have a level of be able to rise up from poverty in a way that we would not have been able to if we'd stayed in Oak Elk Gardens. And you can find out more about that online. If you Google Gautreaux and my name, it'll come up. It will come up. There's some interesting pieces. So here I am in Seattle. Here I am back out of Seattle, sorry. Here I am in Vermont looking at what's going to happen with the rest of my life. And I end up with this job working for our DV Center. They do crisis work for those that are sexual assault and domestic violence victims. And I become part of our special investigations unit. Helping to advocate for people in court, being a part of investigative teams, really working closely with the state's attorney and our local law enforcement. And it was sort of the first time I started stepping into this really legal field. And then an opportunity came for me to run for office. And it still was not something that I was thinking of at all. It sounded like a horrible prospect. But I was asked by multiple people who said, we've seen you stand up for people. You've helped so many in our community. We need your voice in this place. So I get into the legislature as the second African-American woman in the state history, and I'm looking at this sea of all of these faces that look nothing like my own, and learning very quickly about how laws are made and about who gets to be in the room to make those decisions. And it's at this time that I start to learn more and meet individuals in my community who have been directly impacted by the disproportionate level of people of color that are being incarcerated, prosecuted against, and falsely charged in my very own community. It is at that point that I realized that my strength and my passion were not going to be in working on healthcare reform, but I needed to be on the Judiciary Committee. Because in order for us to have the voice that was necessary, the courageous voice that was necessary to push what needed to be pushed to make equity, I had to be there. I had to step into that space. And so here we have, within a state, really disparate outcomes of what's happening between the rates of people up in the northern part of the state versus down in the southern part of the state, where our local law enforcement have been found to profile at a rate higher than that of the city of Chicago, where we have individuals who are being brought up on charges as a weapon to gain information from other persons of interest. But that charge haunts them for the rest of their lives. I have a close friend who actually served prison, and it's so ironic that now the state's attorney is like, let's expunge your record. After she ruined his life, he lost custody of his children, lost his job, and is still unable to find employment. So, as I'm looking at how laws are made, I'm having to use a really critical lens to think about what is the worst case scenario. So in a world where we have equal application of the law, it works out great for everybody. But when we don't, it has devastating impacts. So have we asked all the questions we need to ask before we press this forward? And here's where one of my biggest tests came. Again, I was a DV advocate. I was there helping people trying to escape, families in flight, going on ride-alongs to try to get people out of dangerous situations, so I know fully what that moment in time feels like for that person who's looking for help and looking for justice. And we were approached about a bill that would give law enforcement the ability to seize firearms on a domestic violence call. I get it. There's some problems with that. As a person who's been there, I know some folks that would rather kill everyone than let you take their guns in that situation. But more troubling for me was the fact that we've now opened a door for law enforcement to come in, and anything that they can discover in plain sight gives us now a right for illegal search and seizure. And I'm looking at a system, a criminal justice system in my own community that I don't trust with that ability and that power to be able to do that. And knowing that we have this also confluence of people of color getting the police called on them. And it all depends on how the call comes in as to how law enforcement are going to respond. So this is a really complex situation where we're looking at the dignity of women and children and those that are experiencing abuse. We're looking at the terror that people of color are already experiencing living in our police state, and we're trying to find a way to thread these really disparate places. And that was one of the most, I actually said I didn't want to be on the bill, and I was not going to be able to vote for it when it got to the floor. I knew it would get shot down in the Senate, but I didn't want to do that, right? I couldn't have that blood on my hands. I just couldn't have that blood on my hands. I'm telling you this story because it was one of the most difficult points in my legislative career. And I went to my chair and I said, you know how I feel about this. You know how much this is, how important this is to me, but I can't vote. I'll wait, I won't speak, I won't say anything until we get to the final vote, and then I have an opportunity for vote explanation. So it goes that you do a roll call vote, they call your name, you say yay, nay, whatever you're gonna say. People love to come up with different ways to say yes or no. You get through that point, you get to the point where they're about to announce the actual results of the vote, and you have an opportunity to explain your vote. So I was like, I will wait until I get to vote explanation to say why I have a problem with this. And they said, if you say that, Kaya, you're gonna flip at least 15 or 16 votes. And I didn't want the NRA to win. I didn't want them to think that they won. And again, knowing that it would die in the Senate, I was like, we need to go back and we gotta look at that we gotta look at that constitutional right. I'm not feeling this. But I voted yes. And I walked out of that room, didn't even stick around for the rest of the deliberations, drove over to my place that I was staying at and vomited all over the front lawn. So when we're thinking about how we're gonna talk about application of the law and what that means in practicality, there is a really important component of social consciousness and again of our moral values that we have to keep in the front and center, because the issue of race is the most pivotal within this country. Our entire country was built on racism. So know that that's where it needs to be dismantled, more than almost any other place. So that is what I will say about that. So thank you.
I'm not going. It's not my turn. What I will say is I am a longtime resident of Massachusetts. I was born in Worcester, which is midway in the state, but I grew up in Boston, and I left to go down to DC for college, but I returned home, and I really found my place in the criminal justice space when I got to college, because I spent my internship for my criminal justice degree at the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center, and I was awoken by spending 3 months with young people that were Black and brown only. I don't know that I saw one white juvenile in the facility, and it was Black and Hispanic only. And I could not process and understand at that moment why, what was going on. I talked to the young people that were there. There were young girls that were there as well. And it came to me that, as has already been stated, our system is racist. And I didn't see so much of that growing up, because although I was raised in a single-family household, both of my parents were very much involved, and I had aunts and uncles and a village of people that had raised me, and they worked really, really hard. I had uncles that were in the military, and so I felt that I didn't have the same experience that some of my friends had. I went to an exam school, which is still a public school, but there's 3 exam schools in Boston, and so I had access to certain things that my peers did not, and it came to me at that moment when I was doing the internship that everyone didn't have the same life that I had, that there were a lot of young people that faced poverty, that did not have parents in their lives, and were missing so many of the things that they needed to just move forward. Where they started in life was not the same as mine. And so I kind of embarked on this experience of trying to understand more about the criminal justice system and what it is that I could do. I knew I loved working with young people, and I loved helping people. And I knew my space was in public interest. You know, I graduated from GW, and I came back to Boston, and I said, I'm gonna be a lawyer, I wanna make a bunch of money. And I worked at a firm even before going to law school, and I was like, this is boring. I'm not helping anybody. But I was at a law firm, and there was only one Black attorney that was there. And I was like, this can't be real. You know, where are all the Black lawyers? I don't know. I don't know. And so I left, and I applied for Suffolk. And Suffolk, although wasn't like Northeastern a public interest focus, a lot of the work that they did was partnerships with government agencies. And because they were located in downtown Boston, when I started talking to my pre-law advisor, he said, you know, a lot of the people that graduated from GW went to Suffolk University, and so they definitely had a good relationship there. And I knew I wanted to go home, and I wanted to go home because I felt like if these young people are here in Northern Virginia, they're certainly back home. And that was where I was born and raised, and that's where I wanted to kind of, you know, commit myself to. So I went to Suffolk, and again, I still wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I started taking family law courses, and it became a practice area that touched all different areas. It was representing families, it was domestic violence, it was bankruptcy issues, it was incarceration issues, it was child support issues, it was alimony issues. It touched every single area, and the one common denominator that I found was that poor people particularly were always at a loss. No matter what it was no representation. There's no civil Gideon, there's no right to counsel. If you're losing your housing impacts your ability to keep custody of your children in care and protection cases. If you are incarcerated and you can't pay your child support, and you don't resolve any issues related to your child support while you're incarcerated, when you leave with an arrearage. That arrearage impacts your ability to have your license and your passport and your professional licensures. And so it was like, this is just a circle, quite frankly, I apologize, of bullshit, that people just were unable to really just navigate through the system. And although for me, I wasn't in the criminal justice space, I was in a civil space, and I was like, this is crazy. So I continued after law school, and I worked at a firm, and the majority of the people that we represented were dads. And again, I had a different lens, and I was like, okay, well, you know, this is Massachusetts, it's family law, you know, moms, dads, we're all equal here. And every single father that I had encountered was trying to have custody, was trying to have visitation, was dealing with all of these effects of the system. And they didn't have access to their children, and they didn't have access to representation, they didn't have access to custody, because the way Massachusetts law was set up was that if you're not married, then the mother automatically has custody. And there is no shared custody in Massachusetts unless the parties agree. And so I sat in a place of trying to understand and understanding the value of having both parents involved in a child's life, and realizing that I had dads that I was representing that actually wanted to be involved in their children's life, but were going through these challenges, and thinking about all of the children who did not have dads in their lives, or did not have fathers that were advocating for them, or had absent fathers as a result of a criminal justice system, that our families and Black and brown families were completely dysfunctional. And how are we supposed to help Black and brown children move forward if they don't even have the access to the same things that other people do? And so, you know, I spent a lot of time in that space. I transitioned to legal aid because I wanted to represent poor people. I wanted to represent those that were in the family law space. And, you know, the way Volunteer Lawyers Project worked is we connected pro bono lawyers with families that needed representation. They didn't, again, you know, the legal system is complicated for lawyers, it's complicated for paralegals, it's even more complicated for poor people. It's complicated for people that don't speak English as a first language. You know, we fill our legal forms with legal jargons and fiduciaries and here, there, for, you know, whatever. And we want the average person to be able to come in for simple things. You know, I want to obtain child support. I want to, you know, file a response to an eviction matter. And we hand them a packet of paper that's 40 pages. You know, if you're trying to get guardianship, you're a grandparent and, you know, your child is suffering from, they're going to be incarcerated, or they're suffering from substance use disorder. You know, you hand them a packet of 40 pages, you ask them to understand what the Model Uniform Probate Code is, and you ask them to navigate through a legal process. And it's completely impossible for people. And that was the space that that I existed in for several years. And then an opportunity came up with the court. And it was to create these centers called self-help centers. They have them in many different states. California is at the forefront of self-help centers, but it's for people on the civil side to not provide them representation, but help people understand how to get from point A to point B. And the court was embarking on an opportunity to create them. In legal aid, if you're familiar with how it functions, a lot of legal aid organizations are set up by, their funding is based on their priorities, and at the time, Volunteer Lawyers Project is probably 85%, 90% funded by the Legal Services Corporation, which means that you have to have status. You know, anyone that we represent has to have legal status, refugee or asylee, and they have to be below the poverty line. There's a huge population of people that make $40,000 a year that are above the poverty line, that do not have the funds to hire an attorney, that do not have access to any other resources whatsoever. So for me, I had a challenge, and I said I really need to be in a space where, how do we help more people? And the court had created something. They didn't really create it, they created an idea. And so, you know, I applied to a position with the court, and I got hired, and I thought I was going to walk into a space that was created and a blueprint, and they said, here's an empty room, figure it out. And I said, okay. So, you know, you and that was 5 years ago. And you sit there and you try to think about what are all of the things? What has my experience taught me about poor people, about people that have language needs, people that are illiterate and need to understand, and what do I know about the resources that are here in Massachusetts? And we have law schools and we have legal aid, and so we opened Boston in May 2014, and we opened Greenfield, which is in a rural area similar to Vermont. It is a rural area in the western part of Massachusetts, and so the idea was to look at an urban community as well as a rural community, and then kind of expand. And so after I opened Boston, I was there for 1.5 years, and I was promoted to a senior manager. And at that moment, we were rolling out 4 more centers. And again, in areas that had very high need. So we went to the section of the state to Worcester, we went to the southeast down to Brockton, and we went up north to Lawrence. All areas that have large populations of people of color, large populations of language access, and large populations of poor people. And the centers are there to not only create an opportunity for lawyers to provide services, but we run different clinics. We have internship opportunities. And so again, when you have young people that are going to law school, going to college, and they need these experiences, for me, it's about teaching people about those issues, because I didn't see the issues till I landed in college, and so I didn't have that lens to understand. And so as we can continue to create and train up young people and train up lawyers to understand how poverty intersects with race on multitude of levels, to bring them in, and we have people that come in, white people, white students, white lawyers, black lawyers, Hispanic, and they come in and they had no idea what the system actually functions, because my issue with law school is we don't teach law students what it is to be a lawyer and a practicing lawyer, and what the practicality of it is. And again, that might not be what the role of a law school is, but for me, it's how do I teach young people, lawyers, before they actually land, about the practice, about the process, and how do I insert poverty and racism into their experience so that they understand, while also helping poor populations of people respond to their eviction matter because they've got a racist landlord's lawyer on the other side that could give a care about the displacement of an entire family, about how our statutes say criminal activity is sufficient to remove a family from housing, even if there's not a conviction on the other side, and an arrest can put an entire family out of public housing with no questions asked, and helping them, connect them to resources. And so, the centers for me have been that opportunity. I currently sit as an acting director, which I do the same thing every day, but I think the other part of that role allows me to participate. The trial court now has diversity, equity, inclusion. You would think that criminal justice system would have diversity, equity, and inclusion as a department, but we have one now in 2018 and 19. And so within that space, you have an opportunity to work with other leaders throughout the Commonwealth about how do we talk about race? How do we engage in those conversations? How do we look at the fact that there is not a lot of high-level managers in positions of power? And how do we make everybody kind of think the same and understand that racism does exist in the trial court system, and we need to know about it and we need to do something about it? So that's my paid job, and my non-paying job is the Mass Black Lawyers Association. So for me, that's just another opportunity to work with Black lawyers, create the visibility programs, do community service. We have a Know Your Rights program, which I'll be flying back to Boston to do, which we do in, as I say, we do it in the hood every year with young Black and brown kids about police interactions. So that's who I come to you as.
Awesome. Gets better and better. Well, hi everyone. My name is Ebony Freedom, formerly known as Ebony Nyoni. I changed my last name to Freedom because I did not want to be associated with my oppressor. And Kirkland is a slave master's last name. And so, and on the woman end, I didn't want to have to change it every time I got married. So it's Freedom, and my next husband will take on that last name. Snap your fingers everywhere.
That's all right.
So to try to make a really long story, how do you do your life story in 10 minutes? Like, really long story short, born in Brooklyn, grew up in the Bronx, family moved back to Brooklyn. 17, I went away to college, SUNY Delhi, to study veterinary science. Bombed out because I didn't know you had to really study in college. Went back to my parents' house and attended Brooklyn Tech College for paralegal studies. It's funny, as I'm sitting here, I realized the very close connection I may or may have had with Vermont Law School, because when I was looking at UVM as a potential undergrad school for me, I asked if they had a pre-law program, and they said, no, we don't have one right now, but just take U.S. history and that'll prep you for, but we do have a law school in Vermont Law School. And so I was actually planning on attending that school, but education got in there, and I started studying special education and double majored, and that had to do with law and also racism and that kind of thing. So I was very comfortable doing that. My activism, I say, started in '95 because that's when I came to Vermont to attend the University of Vermont. And the summer that I came, I attended a peace conference at Norwich University. A lot was going on. The Native American director at the Alana Student Center was fired, and students were like burning things on Waterman Lawn, and like everything was going on. And so I started kind of getting my feet wet that way. But okay, now moving forward, there was a point after Trayvon Martin where I was gearing myself up to go to law school again, and I was asking a friend who graduated from this law school. I said, I want to come. Do I have to stay on campus? That was the thing that kept me away, is because I was already a grown person and had my own life, and they said I had to live on campus for 2 years. So I said, oh. But I said, well, maybe in a couple of years I can live on campus. And so what I did was I started a master's course at Norwich for public administration to get my what do you say, brain wet for the law school, or to get prepared. But then I ended up starting Black Lives Matter Vermont, and so it was just all too much. I've always been in training as an activist. My family members were a part of the Black Panthers in New York City, and some of them were a part of or are still part of Nation of Islam. And I just grew up with my aunts and uncles talking to me about all kinds of things. And so I'm fortunate to have had that experience. And I can't say that I didn't see racism in New York City, because I did. I saw colorism, I saw internalized racism, where I was there when, there was a big battle between the Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn and Black people, and all kinds of craziness happening. And I was also in the Bronx, where brown water, like the Flint, Michigan, for some people that's like a new thing. I grew up in the Bronx, and I've been seeing brown water for quite a while. And I still see it when I go back. And so environmental racism has been here since certain people arrived. So there.
Clarify which people?
One big thing, we did a study for 3 months about expulsion and suspension in schools. And I know one thing that got me on board with this, starting an organization, was there were so many parents coming to me because their kids were being expelled from school, suspended, bullied, picked on by the teachers or other administrators, not just by students. And so I got involved, and the more schools I went to, the more overwhelming it became. Even in Africa, I just got back from Kenya last week, and I still had emails from students here in Vermont asking, can I help them? When am I coming back? That kind of thing. It's pretty serious in Vermont. It's startling because it seems like, and I've been here for over 20 years, every time you make some progress, something in the air moves it back. And so it can be a very depressing atmosphere. We did a conference, a women's conference, and at one of the workshops, it was all women of color at Green Mountain College. And I stopped the woman from presenting for a minute. I said, can I ask a question? Can you raise your hand if you're feeling really depressed right now? And 100% of the women of color raised their hand. And that you can't make up. That you can't pretend. And so one of the programs that we decided to start, after, that's okay. You know, the Women's March happened in 2017, and all these women came out and threw pink hats on with pointy thingies, corners, and that was supposed to be a revolution. And I was asked to speak, and it was funny because Bernie Sanders surprised everyone, and he spoke, and then all the cameras and everything came out, Bernie! And then when he left, everyone dissipated. It's like, and then I stood up. But one thing I'm known for is speaking the truth. I don't compromise. I don't want to, you know, play the role of someone trying to get ahead somewhere. And that makes me sleep well at the end of the day. And but others, they stay up thinking about how to bring me down. And there's been plenty of slanderous campaigns against me because I spoke up about about the systems in Vermont. So anyway, I said the only way that women, white women and black women, can truly become unified, can truly move forward as sisters, is if white women acknowledge their part that they've played in our oppression. And so from that point on, after that came conferences. We have a 3-part series of conferences where white women participate and black women run the workshops and are the key speakers and kind of present where they are now with things. And we move forward together. And out of that, it's called, what is it called? That's a shame. It's called Sisters Keeper Challenge. And out of the last, from the last conference came Sisters Keeper quarterly retreats, where we want to start to undergird women of color in this state. Because for the over 20 years I've been here, some phenomenal women of color have come, but then they've gone because the pressure is so intense. The pressure is so thick. and you just feel like you're being attacked from all sides. So when Kaya was going through what she was going through, it's like if you're a woman of color and you're a leader in Vermont, you totally get it. You totally get it. And so this program is meant to be able to provide the resources that women of color need in this state to stay in this state and continue to grow in leadership, because that's not available. Even receiving death threats, that's not available. Being attacked and then you being blamed and no support for that is available. And so this is what we're doing. We just got a small grant and we're trying to raise money for these quarterly retreats. And they're supposed to happen 4 times a year. And we're going to have financial advisors, this, that, and the other to support women of color staying in the state, because it's very important. And I don't have time now, but if you want to know some of the reasons for why it's important, I can tell you afterwards. But to not have Black women in this state would be a tragedy. So and last but not least, recently I had surgery, and my crazy self, some weeks after that, shipped myself off to Kenya, Africa, because I wanted to heal. I knew I couldn't heal here. It had become so emotionally distressing, just so like crushing. I felt like I couldn't make it. There's hardly any support, but by some of the, your closest friends, your closest allies. Those people are your support. But otherwise, it's a dangerous place to be in emotionally. So I went to Africa because I wanted to heal and I wanted to write a book. And I'm still playing around with the title, but it's called Detoxing from White Supremacy. And I kept changing the format while I was there, because I kept wanting to talk about my experience in Vermont, but then that was part of the supremacy. It's so ingrained in me that I'm all the way in East Africa thinking about Vermont. And so I started changing, like taking those pieces out and just focusing on my detox, what's keeping me alive, what's helping me to survive for when I go back to Vermont. And it was amazing experience. It was the food, because some of these things we don't think about because we don't think it's so important, but it really, really is. It's the food that we're eating that we're not accustomed to in Vermont that's causing us to have so many health problems. All my friends, the women of color, especially the Black women, they're all suffering from some chronic illness. Literally, I can't say there's one that's not in Vermont, who live in Vermont. And then just being able to be around Black people who are not looking, people who, are not focusing on, you walk in a room, everyone's like this. Just being able to go in a bank and see, that's spiritual too, to see people who look like you, who are directors of places, bank managers, just see people of color places. Right now, you can go in Vermont and you can see people. I live in Chittenden County on purpose, but you go to, what is it called? UVM Medical Center, the biggest hospital. You'll see people of color, but ask them what their positions are. Go to the schools. And let me know if you see any principals or administrators of color, teachers of color. It goes on, and that tears at people, especially if you're a young person. Curriculum, hardly anyone of color doing something exceptional. You know, the only time they want to do it is during this month, and then they want to talk about slavery. So I can go on and on, but legal, I forgot to bring my young cousin. He's in the Vermont State Prison, and he was supposed to be released 2 to 3 years ago. He's literally there after having served all his time. He's still in jail. And he's a young guy. And I feel bad because he sends me these letters, these long letters. Can you help me, please? I tried to go for, you know, a nonprofit organization that helps prisoners, inmates, and they didn't get back to me. They just treat them like crap. Once you're in the jails in Vermont, you get treated like crap. I know because I've worked with a lot of young people. And recently, as soon as I got back from Africa, I checked the mail, and he said, well, I finally got in that program. They said I had to attend before I can be released. And he said there was an incident where one of the guards attacked him. And he said, the guard is saying I attacked him, but he's lying. And I filed a complaint and everything, but no one would listen to me. And that's how it is in the system. You're totally and completely powerless. So my thing that I've discovered, and it's not the answer for everyone, it's kind of like, am I Marcus Garvey-an? Am I a Malcolm X, making our own community? Maybe a little bit of both. I say not go back to Africa. I say go forward to Africa. Go heal and feel that African sun. I felt so good there. I felt so much healing there. So that's why I know, number one, what's important for people of color or oppressed people is cultural preservation. You have to. Otherwise, there's no you. And so we can't begin to attack the systems that I'm starting to believe will never be taken down. You have to make your own systems. You have to build what you want to see. We have to take care of ourselves and each other as well. And if you're an ally, if you're a white ally, you have to care. And you have to be quiet. At the women's conferences, they laugh when I say that. Like, white women have to shut up and listen and hear what we have to say. And so, but love, if you have love, you understand that language. Like, I understand what you're saying. So I am going to shut up, and I'm going to listen. And that's what I have to say about that.
Well, thank you guys very much, everybody. I think we can give them a nice round of applause for that. Thank you. Thank you guys so much for sharing those stories with us. And I think everybody here is probably super excited to get around to asking some questions. We did have a couple questions that people who couldn't make it today had asked us to ask, but I think we're going to go directly to the audience. So I was just thinking that maybe while you're answering audience questions, you could just keep a few of these things in mind and maybe weave them into your answers, and just about how you feel like the Me Too movement has served women of color in the legal profession, how racism comes about and is dealt with in the legal field, and what methods of self-care you feel like really come into play in the legal profession. So we can go and see what people have to ask us in the audience. Anybody? The first person gets a prize. There you go.
Thank you. I don't need a prize. My name is Justin Simolovsky, and thank you all for coming. I guess just a question I've been wondering about is if there are any thoughts on the First Step bill that was passed back in December, and what impacts. I know that only impacts federal penitentiaries, but if there's any thoughts on what a second step would be?
We don't know what
None of us know what you're speaking about. Can you give us a little context?
So, geez, I wish I had more context. But back in, at the end of December, right before the shutdown, there was a compromise where a criminal justice reform bill was passed. Van Jones was one of the big advocates for it, and it essentially set the ball rolling for reducing criminal populations, and they called it the First Step Bill because it was very minor and that it didn't address all the problems, but getting that first piece of legislation can open the door for potential subsequent pieces. I was hoping maybe that you had some opinions, but if not, I'll follow up.
May I?
So I think one of the things to know, that's what's really fascinating about Vermont. So if we're really thinking about what this means on a national scale, it's an important question. But right here you have an opportunity to do a really deep dive and case study in looking at this state. So I'm part of a group that is working on trying to establish some legislation specifically to support Black elected officials to be able to move forth policy that will help to elevate our communities, right? And as we went through our priority list, I'm like, Vermont's done most of that. We've done quite a significant amount of criminal justice reform. We've done quite a bit to push equality, looking at a number of different really key areas that are supposed to move the needle. And yet, here we still are, hearing very clearly about the challenges that we have in the state. So what's missing? So for me, I think that there's a great opportunity to have policy that's passed, but it's also about what happens afterwards and that application of the law, and as well as what's happening within our actual environments that impact that efficacy, ultimately. So, you know, it's great to be able to look at, can we get people out of prison and then be able to move them forward? But if we're still dealing with housing discrimination, if we're still dealing with, we have banned the box here, but that's not for all, it's just for state employees. So there are multiple ways that we know that people that are coming out are gonna need support. We wanna keep them from going in, but we also don't wanna create a new slavery system where people have electronic monitoring on their bodies and can't leave their homes. Like, there's much to this conversation that needs to be really critically analyzed, because many of the same supporters from like ALEC and some of these other places that were previously silent or outwardly hostile, one of the two, when it came to criminal justice reform, are now completely behind it. So we need to be really mindful about what is the intent and whether or not those applications are going to actually do more good or more harm for the populations that we serve. But we really need to abolish our prison industrial complex, but understand that it's made to be a very complex system that it's going to be difficult to dismantle it. And that's on purpose. That's very intentional.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would just add that I think that waiting on our federal government to do anything about the problem that we're in is never going to happen. Even if they pass a second step and a third step and a fourth step, we're so far behind that we really need to be investing, I think, our time and efforts into electing officials that are just going to do it on their own and not wait for laws to change or wait for people to get behind it if they're not. I mean, we've got this first step, we're talking about mass incarceration nationally, and like people are patting themselves on the back, and then, you know, a friend of mine in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, decides she's not gonna prosecute marijuana possessions, and she's getting death threats, and even her own mayor and police chief are attacking her on it. So you really, like, if you really want to talk about reform, like, you have to support the people that are actually doing it and going out on a huge limb to do it, and not just talking the talk. And you also need to run against people that aren't. I mean, that's not to make it all about politics, but it really is, like, you know, I have the utmost respect for legislators, but at the end of the day, they do have that ability to just get run out by big money. And not that that can't happen to prosecutors too, but at least in the meantime, they can make those decisions day to day that are actually impacting the system and maybe get voted out in 4 years. But in the meantime, they're stuck with you. So do what you can while you're in it.
I would probably just add, you know, along the same lines, in Massachusetts, we We have a new criminal justice reform bill that's there, and the governor recently proposed some, some amendments to it. But I think that it's similar. You've got to take care of home first, and that was kind of a lot of the reasons why I came back to Boston, because these are people. For me, it's my people, and so when you're looking at local politics and you're looking at the things that impact our current criminal justice systems in the state, we have problems across the board. I mean, we have, a sheriff in one of the counties that, often talks about his support of building a wall, who talks about sending his inmates to build the wall, who wants to eliminate face-to-face visitations. Who wants to charge rent to the inmates? And that happens, and it's Hodges, who's the sheriff of Bristol County. So he was recently on, I think, Nesson. So look him up. I mean, these systems are so close to home, it's disgusting. And so I think a lot of what is to be said is that, you've got to take, if there are issues here in Vermont, then, look at how and what are ways that, you can use your resources, you can use your education, you can use your privilege to address those particular issues locally. Or if you're from another state and you're just here for law school, what can you learn from this law school to take back to your hometown to impact those issues? If the First Step bill, if that's important to you, figure out who wrote it, who's working on it. And I will say, for me, I don't like politics. We did recently elect our first Black woman, African-American woman district attorney, and there was a lot of work behind that. The ACLU did a lot of work on, the difference a DA makes, because the DA, and particularly in Massachusetts, has unfettered authority to literally do whatever they want. And so, it's where the prosecution starts. Are there juvenile diversion programs? I'll add, I just spent 4 months on grand jury in Suffolk County. And so I think by the second month, it was painful. It was utterly painful. So many people say, oh, how was grand jury service? It was traumatic to see there and to sit in as a civilian, with a lawyer hat on, as a person that grew up in the county in which I was sitting there, to see how the system and how Black and brown people were being prosecuted by white ADAs and white police officers that were over-policing a population for people that I knew that had literally walked through this system, and then no one cared. Literally no one cared. So it's challenging, but I think ultimately the importance is, regardless of what you do with your education, to make it meaningful, and to use your voice to empower people that are oppressed. And if you are privileged, to use your privilege in a way that is helpful and not harmful.
I have worked in community economic development. That's what I started using for. And so what I hear a lot is that one of the challenges in Vermont is just not enough housing, so that we have a number of hundreds of people who can't get out of prison just because the housing isn't available. There are housing subsidy and housing programs in Vermont. We need that extra housing for a variety of reasons, but I keep asking and wondering if there might not be an effort made to develop housing, perhaps overseen after people get out, overseen by the restorative justice folks or something like that, that would help to move at least those 200 or 300, I forget what the number is, out of incarceration. And everybody, of course, sort of, kind of nod, and there we are.
I think that, excuse me, regarding that issue, I've had a lot of personal experiences because I have a pretty significant amount of family here in Vermont now, and a lot of younger cousins and a lot of younger male cousins. And so they've unfortunately had to experience the criminal justice side of the system, and I think the problem is based on a 19th century idea of what an inmate is and what a prisoner is, and they can't come back to their family if the family receives any sort of public housing subsidies or anything. They can't go back to their family. And one thing that I recognized from trying to help my own nephew the last time was that there is this clause that says they can, the probation officer can agree to let them out on the streets or something of that nature. So there are some even options that they're not being afforded. Some folks are not being afforded. The other thing we have to look at is that our governor is in support of public prisons, of private prisons. And so there's money to be lost by letting people out.
Thank you.
I'll just leave that there on the table. I really do think that there is an opportunity by looking at the housing situation, almost, you know, just to see if in going not going to housing and community development and saying, look, can you develop a program, you know, and matching that up.
We do have some programs like that. We need to not underestimate the NIMBY effect of people not wanting things in their community. We can't even get homeless shelters sometimes established in communities because people just really want the problems to not be visible. And so we have built such a, I mean, and the folks that are coming out of our criminal justice system have been, they've been broken. They've been broken. They're not coming back. They're not coming back the whole individuals that they deserve to be, and they need greater supports, and we've built a real boogeyman around that. And so people are very much afraid. So I know that there have been some huge efforts of different groups that have tried to do that, but it's also around us looking at what's happening again in the environment where we try to impact those policies.
But that's why I suggested that it work with restorative justice. I mean, I know in White River that there are half a dozen apartments of folks who are working with restorative justice in White River. So it's not something that can solve the whole problem, but it might be a piece that can be taught.
We do have that in Burlington as well. It's called Circles, and it's through our restorative justice program. It's great, but it can only do so much.
Thank you guys so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see a panel of such brilliant women. Sorry, some of us left for a con law lecture and came back. So connecting actually those, excuse us, sorry.
No. Flashbacks.
Connecting those two, the governor supporting for-profit prisons and the NIMBY problem, which I think is everywhere, but it seems very pronounced in Vermont. I'm wondering if there's anything you think we can do about, for people who don't know, 215 Vermont prisoners are in a core civic facility in Mississippi now after being moved from Pennsylvania, where 4 of our prisoners died in a for-profit prison. And how we're justifying moving people thousands away from their support structure, and then making that support structure unfeasibly expensive to maintain, and what, if anything, you can imagine just Vermonters doing to communicate to the legislature that we don't want deals with
We had that conversation. They didn't really care, but yeah, we wrote some pretty strong letters about that. My recommendation for you as students, invite the governor in. We invited the AG to our place last week and asked him about that, and he said, all I do is just sign off and make sure it's legally viable. It doesn't violate any Vermont law. So I would invite your legislators here and ask them those very questions. Go and ask them questions. Start talking to the families of prisoners. We're getting letters from families of prisoners talking about how they keep losing all of their stuff along the way. Use your skills that you have now to communicate with those 215 people that are gone and bring those stories back to Vermont and amplify those voices. Make them real people in the eyes of the legislature. Because right now, the only voice they have is the emails that their family sends us.
I think for me, a lot of people say, and you have to have a comprehensive approach, but when people start getting angry enough, and usually, unfortunately, it has to touch home, things have to, death usually needs to occur, but when people get angry enough, they'll be at the State House. They'll be constant, relentless. And then things will change.
No, that doesn't feel like a very hopeful answer,
Yeah.
but I mean, I'm a living example of how you can do all the right things and nothing still works out. And so people are having to press and ask questions and really put people's feet to the fire. Doesn't mean that things will change for me, but perhaps it can change for someone else. So.
Yeah, and I totally agree of like the personal stories. I mean, for me, the way that I'm sort of tackling it is I'm starting with people that are serving life without parole sentences in Vermont because it's only 17 people. And so I know that at least one of them never killed anybody. Like he was an accomplice in a homicide and he was 22 years old. But he did not kill anybody. And for me, that's completely unacceptable that he's serving a life without parole sentence. So if you start with kind of this smaller number that's a little more manageable and finding these stories and doing something about that, it starts to break down one human at a time.
And so I have two things. One, the issue of, not in my backyard is clear, right? So we have an opioid issue in Boston, right? And the area in which we call it Methadone Mile at this point, and it's actually state police property, but the problem is it's at the intersection of when people come off of the highway into Boston, and it intersects with Roxbury and the South End and all of those areas, and there's a school that resides right there. And when I tell you that there are certain areas that are in the towns, Boston's broken up into towns, that do not have public housing. Those are predominantly white communities. And so when they are talking about reopening a bridge to the wet shelter to have a place for people to go that are in Methadone Mile, that is like 2-3 years out. And so they have zero plan on what to do, but every time they looked at places throughout the city to put people, because that area is so condensed with properties and buildings. There's no room. The places that actually have the grass and the areas to build a shelter are in those areas that are predominantly white, and so there's tremendous pushback. And so what happens is Methadone Mile and a lot of the people that are suffering from substance use disorder are in communities of color, and despite attempts to amplify their voices, they continue to be ignored and nobody cares. And even when you have children that were poked by needles, and it was all over the news, and there was protests, there still has been very limited, very minimal action by the state police, by the state, and by the mayor of Boston to address those issues. And so it's one of those things where you have people of color, and I think the important part of understanding the many issues, there's so many people of color that are working, but there are so many more people that are working to push back on everything it is that we want to do and every step forward that we want to make. And I think a lot of challenges for people of color, particularly with the Me Too movement and the Women's March, and why you didn't see a lot of women of color there, is that the feeling that white women particularly do not support black women in the way that we support. And so I often see it, and I'll talk about, being in the court. There are situations that come up, and as a person of color and high-level leadership, that if there are other women, white women in that same position, their issues are always gender-based. It's not race and gender-based. There's no advocacy. You know, for me, I would not rely on any of them to advocate for me if I was in a position where white men were coming for me, or coming for my position, or creating a space that was uncomfortable for me. There would be absolutely no advocacy. And I know white women who advocate for Black and brown people, and she has sat in a space with all of them, because they're all white men, white men and white women, and they have all put their head down and allowed her to be berated. And she's a white woman advocating for Black and brown issues. So, you know, I think to my point is that we need white people and white women and white men who have privilege to understand the plight and the Black and brown plight, and to use your voice to amplify the issues that we have. And the reason why a lot of the federal custody issues is that they're forgotten about. They're just literally, they're sent off to prison, federal prison, they're moved around, their families can't get to them because of poverty, nobody really cares, legislators don't care. And so, you know, it's challenging because it's important to you, it's important to some other, to other people, but because of poverty issues, those families who can't speak, who can't travel, who can't advocate, they're at a loss. They're at a complete loss. And so I would absolutely agree that, you know, bring your governor in here, and you have to show that you want to advocate for them, that you want to speak for them, because quite frankly, their families can't speak for them. They're not in positions to speak for them, and they don't even care what they would have to say. But if you all invited them here and you all spoke for them, that's a whole different voice that legislators, because they're thinking about your votes. They're thinking about how do they stay in office. And when it came down to the nomination of, I don't even know his name, who's the new justice on that?
Kavanaugh.
Yeah, when it came down to that, the decisions were based on, and those folks down there in DC were making decisions based on who was gonna keep them in office, not based on their moral compass. Because if they used their moral compass and didn't care about whether they got voted in for the next election, he wouldn't be sitting down there right now.
Just to add to that quickly, caveat number one, if you are going to go and get the stories from people and, you know, bring their stories forward, be careful of trauma tourism, as Curtis Reed likes to say. Don't just get their stories and like, look, they're bleeding. You know, like you remember those commercials like back in the 80s where they had like, what's her name? Real white woman with the blonde hair. Sally Struthers with some little Black kid in Africa. And like, it was the most like horrifying example of like trauma tourism I've ever seen. So number one, no trauma tourism. And number two, if any of you ever have occasion to look at a bill, or you're, you know, somebody's asking you to craft some language around a bill, and somebody, especially if it's a bill that is, you know, ethnically related, not that I'm going anywhere specific with this. Yes, you are. But if there is a bill about ethnic studies or, you know, something like that, and it's about people of color finally getting their thing, and, you know, and doing their thing, do not, white people, I don't care where you coming from, please do not say, well, what about me? Why am I not in this bill? You're everywhere. You're everywhere, all right? Nobody's gonna forget about you. But let us, please, just let us have our bill, all right? You know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But, so seriously, no, but I'm really serious. Like, one of the things you can do is protect. When we put up legislation, when we finally get our voice, stop other white people from taking that and whining. Like when she was talking about white women at conferences, Ebony, I'm like, the last thing I want is white women's tears. Stop it. If we're going to talk about this as women, I don't need your tears. That's my little, thank you.
So we have time for 2 more questions.
I got to go. I'm sorry, though. I coach. So
And thank Tabitha Moore for her contributions to our second panel today. And please.
So I was just going to ask, what are your thoughts and observations on restorative justice and restorative justice practices? And it was mentioned some of the limitations. What are some of those limitations?
It's completely underrated and misunderstood would be my very short answer. I think that It's a really powerful and incredible response. I think that it holds offenders much more accountable than our criminal justice system does. You know, if somebody comes in, like for example, you know, I recently got a hard time about sending a mural, a guy that vandalized a mural up on Church Street. Rather than charging him, I sent him through the restorative justice panel. I did that because I wanted that person to be accountable to the community quickly and not, for lack of a better term, get his day in court to brag about what he had done. And he was involved with the restorative justice panel within a week. If that had gone through the system, it'd be 6 months, maybe 9 months before he's in front of a judge saying that he did what he did, and it's in like a 5-minute colloquy with the judge. And there's no accountability to the community or anybody who felt victimized by that. But most people see that as not charging, not prosecuting, not holding an offender accountable, when frankly I think it's all of those things. I think that in general we need to really redefine what prosecution means, and I wholeheartedly believe that the restorative justice process is still prosecution. It's just a different response to an issue. I don't know that every community, I'm very lucky to be in Chittenden County and be in Burlington. Every town has a restorative justice. I don't think everywhere in Vermont has that, and I think that's unfortunate. But I think that once people actually recognize what it is, they're very supportive of it, but not enough people do.
And also looking at the rate of plea deals that we end up having here in our state. So there's a sort of, again, it's like we don't want to see it. We want the crime committed, and then we want to distance ourselves from it, right? And kind of remove that humanity from it. And I think restorative justice allows for a mechanism for community accountability in a way that you wouldn't get. So if I was to take one of these individuals that I had been struggling with for the last 2 years and fighting being terrorized for, having them sit in front of a panel of community members who are able to be like, as a community, we have an issue with what just happened here, and we need to find a way to make people whole. That might be an opportunity to raise a small measure of visibility, but again, I think it could, for some cases, be more healing than what we might go through in a standard criminal justice system. And so, like, kind of as we think of our normal criminal justice practices. So I think there's an enormous possibility there to reduce the number of prosecutions and to not have people feel like they have to take plea deals in order to start to work on whatever's brought them in front of the courts that day. So I think, and it could be better for the victims as well, because even going through the civil courts for a relief for abuse order, it was 45 minutes of hell. That was 45 minutes of hell. And I had a few friends with me versus a community behind me.
But what I want to say is also be careful. Some of those restorative justice panels have, like I've experienced a few college students from UVM, for example, you know, and they were three white women. Not that we're against white women right now, but I'm just making an example. And it was a woman of color who was going up before the panel. They don't understand, and they didn't understand by their comments. And so, you know, there's no one perfect system, but I feel like more of the community needs to be a part of these kind of restorative panels. I also feel like I was working with the Deputy Commission for Department of Human Services for a while, and we were talking about Department of Children and Family Services and all the things wrong with it and some solutions. And in the end, they ended up throwing out a lot of my suggestions because it was working people out of jobs. And that's the first time I got it. I'm like, oh, you know, they want to work. And so it's hard. It's hard, and it's very complicated problems. But I think the first step should be reintroducing the community back into solving their own problems. giving them that power, giving them the resources to solve their own scenarios.
But also ensuring that representation matters, because if these panels we're finding that they're all white, that's not going to be helpful when we're dealing with issues of race.
Right.
And those intersections. So it's important that that reform happens in all different areas.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. This has been a really wonderful panel. I have a couple of quick anecdotes, and I have a question for you. First of all, I was a practicing lawyer in Chicago, and one of the things I did was I took on a pro bono death penalty appeal, which got me to go to the Pontiac Correctional Facility in Pontiac, Illinois, which is a middle of the state, very rural, very white. And what was striking about going there the first time was all the inmates, literally every one was black, brown, and yellow. And then all the guards were white. And so small wonder there's a lot of tension there. But through a partner of mine, I got to meet the warden of Pontiac Correctional Facility. And I took a couple of summer associates once to meet our client who was there. And we also got to talk to the warden. And one of the questions that was asked was, what do you do to rehab these prisoners? And the warden, who's a hardened veteran of the Department of Corrections in Illinois, kind of looked at us like, are you kidding me? And he said, we give them a bus ticket to anywhere they want to go when they leave and $20. And so small wonder that the recidivism rate was like, I don't know, 80, 90%. So we're, warehousing these people, not giving them any education or training while they're there. And so they commit crimes again. Then fast forward to my time here in Vermont. We live in the town of Hartford, which is about, 20 minutes north or south of here. And a few years ago, an organization called the Dismas House, maybe you're familiar with them, Sarah, but they bought a house, and we're going to build a halfway house for recently released inmates who are nonviolent offenders. And ironically enough, the biggest opponent was this couple that call themselves Christians, that had a church and a school, and they fought this thing tooth and nail. And I just thought that's so rich with irony. But it has been in business now for, I think, 2 years or so, and it's been a wonderful addition to the community, I think. But the question I have for you is, what can black men do to help you? We've talked a lot about women of color, but what can we do to help? And how do you see our role playing in these issues that you're all confronting? Thank you.
So, so through a couple different lenses, I think as attorneys in the attorney lens, I think black women attorneys often feel that when black men attorneys make it, they forget about us. And they forget their responsibility and obligation to ensure that they bring us with them. Because the numbers of black women attorneys in particular positions is like 1%, like nationwide. Whether it's partners at firms, high-level executives, it's like 1%. And get 1% on your exam and see what that feels like. And so I feel that there's this forgetfulness or this amnesia about the struggle is equal. And so I would say that, you become partner, you become an executive, you lift as you climb. So I would say that there's one thing. But I also believe that in the space of poverty and young kids, there are a lot of young black men and women who have lost their parents to the system. And so when we just think about the 1980s and the war on drugs, those folks are coming back into the community now, right? They did their 20 years for marijuana that people are becoming rich off of and not our people. And so you have these situations where you now have a lot of families that have absent parents. And so it's really important that we black men think about the young black and brown girls that didn't have that father figure, and they reach back. And for me, just working with teen girls and teen boys and seeing the numbers of gang involvement becoming, it's like 13 and 14-year-olds. Chicago's facing 11 and 12-year-olds involved in this. And so I think that becomes a space where that mentorship, we talk about mentorship, but it's not there the way that I would love to see it. But I think that mentorship is really important for young people going up through the system. I teach at Bunker Hill, which is a community college back home, but I teach at the high school, and I teach juniors and seniors, and it's an area that's predominantly Latino kids, and I've got juniors and seniors, and I have no idea how they got there. I don't know how they were able. Their literacy is very low, and you know what? They're going to graduate. They're not going to go to college, and I don't know. I literally don't know what's going to happen to them. And so for me, that's the biggest struggle of feeling like, you move young people through the system and they don't have a bank account card, the English is limited, they can't write a full sentence. There's so many spaces in there. So those would be the two. That's my two asks for you, sir.
I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that question in this kind of environment. I think that's more of a private question for our community. But I will say, recognize that internalized racism is real, sexism is super real, and that even as we struggle together to resist racism, that there are other isms that play out in our community that we need to recognize and deal with.
If I was to say anything, it's that, and if I'm speaking specifically to Black men in Vermont, recognizing that there are many brothers who are hiding as for self-preservation. Their visibility, their hyper-visibility makes them a target through many systems, and when they do speak up, things happen. And so for the brothers in my community that tried to come out and talk with the ACLU, have been going to forums and speaking up, it's not surprising they suddenly start getting stopped multiple times. They're back in court on crazy charges. So, but what they're also realizing is that we need each other. That we need each other right now. So those who, I hate to feel like that, but that's all we have is each other.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for coming here and speaking with us today. On behalf of everybody, I think I can say that it's been a very, very wonderful day filled with great conversation. And now we're just gonna have Miriam Hinson come up and with just a few little things that she wants to say and give to you guys.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
On behalf of Vermont Law School Black Law Student Association, Latin American and Caribbean Law Student Association, Women's Law Group, and National Lawyers Guild, I would like to present this as a token of our appreciation. Thank you. Sarah George. I'm sorry, this is gonna fall. No, I'm going to help you. You do individual pictures and do a group picture? Sure. Okay.
Can you see us? You're going to be on.
Kia Morris.
That's right. Stand up.
Kia Morris. Sharice Perry. And Ebony Freedom.
Freedom. Freedom way.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Are you going to do a group?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, let's go down so then they can get the logo. Thank you. I don't know what else is happening with the program.
Just tell them to go disperse.
I want to end today's conference with a word of thanks. I want to thank everybody from the VLS community, from the Upper Valley community, from our friends at Dartmouth to our friends in Burlington for making it out here today. We had over 400 people log on to watch this live. So while the room feels as it does, please do know that we had a larger footprint than just this room could hold. And if I can thank each of the panelists for joining us today, Kaya, Sarah, Charisse, Kathleen, thank you very much. Ebony, and though Gwendolyn's not here, massive, massive amounts of gratitude to her. And a word of thanks to Keisha and Sandy Baird for making it out here. I'd like to take a minute to thank the VLS students who really helped put this together and bind it. Jacqueline Waller, Miriam Hinson, Natasha Tremblay, Rico Edwards, and then our front registration folks, Kyron Williams, Diana Edse, and Ashley Angel. But if I can have the final word about thanking Terry Ann Campbell, who in title, by title is the vice president of BAL. So a little note about that. She was elected to be secretary last April, and the people that I tapped for the vice presidency didn't return in August. And when we were planning the year out, Terry volunteered to come down to the leadership council, leadership conference with me in New York. And it was on that weekend that she asked if she could fill that role, and my heart almost exploded. I was just overwhelmed with gratitude because this person who helped me survive my first year law school, was there for study groups, there to dine, there to celebrate every holiday, had also committed herself to being more than vice, but co-chair, co-leader, and it's just, this event would never have happened. My year would not have happened had it not been for Terry Ann Campbell. So just a round of applause and a massive gratitude. And with that, reception's begun, and please feel free to bend people's ears about what you've heard today. Cheers.